And so on those occasions then when the jug is used to pour forth a libation, an offering to the gods then are brought in. And so we have in a very concrete way this fourfold is gathered. The gods and mortals, the earth and the sky, are gathered in the process of this thing, this jug, thinging. So he says, things thing, and in thinging they world. They create realms of meaning and significance and cultural value. And in this process, what happens is that in this presencing process, the thing thinging, it gathers the remoteness of the gods and the mortals. It gathers them and pulls them together and makes them manifest in a particular thing, in a particular place, a near place. And so things in the process of thinging actually near. They make the near near. They also make the far near. And so this is all brought together through the act of some object, a thing thinging, or presencing, making itself manifest. And so we can see here how Heidegger privileges the near, and he says that in contrast, the world built by globalization is a world that creates the distanceless. And this distancelessness effaces the near, and in effacing the near, it also strips meaning away from cultural authenticity. And things are what confer on cultures their authenticity. He doesn't use the word culture or authenticity in this essay, but it's the upshot of what he's saying. And so the things, and this is what objects do. Now, real objects, valid objects, not the objects in the distanceless global world that we're building, the world built out of Marc Augé's non-places, you know, the world of gas stations and shopping malls and parking lots that are the same all over the world no matter where you go. That would be the opposite of what Heidegger's talking about here. He's talking about the local and the authentic, real things that manifest their presences forth, and in doing so gather and integrate mortals and divinities, sky and earth, and make them manifest through the presencing process. And so things think. Now, basically what he's doing here is, it's very interesting because I think what he's doing here, near the end of the essay, he says that in doing this process, these things create a ring. The gods and the mortals, heaven and earth, they create a ring. Now that ring image is tantamount, essentially, as I said, to a miniaturization of Gebser's mythical consciousness structure, which involves the ring, the two-dimensional polaristic ring, like the yin-yang image that divides heaven from earth and the personal soul from the collective soul. And the ring is the primary image of that mythical consciousness structure. So it's almost as though he were miniaturizing that to this idea of this mandala that is gathered together and presenced through things, valid things. And also, though, if you look basically at what Heidegger's doing, I think what he's doing is it's tantamount to performing Gebser's integral consciousness structure. So Gebser says that the mental consciousness structure, which is basically what Heidegger here means by science, is what has pulled things apart. Both Heidegger and Gebser agree on this. That the mental consciousness structure of science pulls everything apart, analyzes it, destroys it, pulls the world apart. But for Gebser, starting in the 19th century, the integral consciousness structure was beginning to constitute itself, in which the world pulled apart by science is integrated and brought back together. The man is brought back together with the woman in balance and harmony. Outside is brought together with inside through Bauhaus architecture, which eliminates the wall, and you get this transparent wall that brings outside and inside together. In Jungian psychology, we get the integration of the conscious and the unconscious. They're brought together. Space and time are brought together with Einstein when he brings time up as the fourth dimension of physics. Space and time are brought together. So everything in the integral consciousness structure it integrates the world that science has sundered into pieces. And basically what Heidegger is doing, I think, in all of his essays and in all of his work, is performing that integral consciousness structure. Heidegger goes through and he shows you the world that science has ravaged, and he goes through and he shows you how art, essentially, art and ritual and custom, put the world back together and integrate it in a fresh and revivifying way. And I think, though, that just as in the mythical consciousness structure where we have the circle, the ring that Heidegger here miniaturizes, you have the ring and you have the world of the mental consciousness structure, especially in its late perspectival Northern European Atlantic phase, which creates a world, as Heidegger says in another essay, of the world picture. It creates an objectifying world spread out in space in a three-dimensional way. If you combine those two, this essence of three-dimensional space, and you combine that with the ring, you get the sphere. And so Gebser says that as we move from the ring of the mythical consciousness structure to the triangle that cuts the ring of the mental consciousness structure, with the integral consciousness structure, we get this idea of the world as a sphere, a giant macrosphere, which is essentially what physics now has validated as. It's a gigantic balloon, basically expanding out like this. It's a giant sphere. And so for Gebser, the integral consciousness structure creates a sphere, which is interesting because Peter Sloterdijk, as we've talked about in a previous essay, has written his book about spheres, showing how what has happened in the history of the West is that the sphere, the great macrospheres encasing the Earth, collapsed with the rise of the Copernican revolution, starting with Copernicus and Galileo and the rise of the sciences. The spheres collapsed, and ever since then we've been creating these artificial substitute spheres through architecture, with the Crystal Palace, in one way or another, or with the greenhouse effect, the global warming of gases that has created a kind of gaseous sphere around the Earth. And then he says today that the spheres are broken, and all that's left is a kind of social foam in which each individual creates his own sphere. So you get this idea of foam, which is made up out of all these little tiny microspheres. So Sloterdijk doesn't see us inside of a sphere anymore, whereas Gebser says that's precisely what is happening, is that through the integral consciousness structure, we're recreating a new sphere. A sphere is coming back into being that is integrating everything that science has pulled apart. And I think Heidegger's, one of his key role, I think his key historical role, his destiny role, if you want to put it that way, is to take part in performing this process of integrating what science has sundered. And his idea of the thing-thinging, by pulling the far and making it near and concrete, is a perfect manifestation, a perfect performance of Gebser's integral consciousness structure. And so that basically is the essence of the essay. And so I don't think that Heidegger would see the world that science is building as at all moving in the right direction. I think he would be very critical about the sort of global cosmopolis that we're building today, which is basically a gigantic anti-world, an unworld, a world that is the opposite of the culturally authentic world of the near and the concrete. That traditional culture was its duty and job to build and manifest and presence the gods through this process. I think what's happening now is the creation of this abstract world of gas stations, parking lots, and shopping malls, which correspond more or less to the devivification process of Platonic science that has turned specific concrete things into these abstract transcendental objects that exist in this sort of empty phase space, denuded of any kind of earthly qualities whatsoever. The thing that both the artist does and the ritual, in the sense that he talks about here of the thing, is that it takes things and it embeds them in contextual life worlds. It embeds them in earth. So what science does is it lifts things up out of the earthly and platonically transcendentalizes them, but things through custom and ritual are embedded in the earth. The earth is set forth in them, and they're embedded in the earth. And so Heidegger is doing in this essay kind of what he did in Being and Time, where he sort of set about to repair the ontological divorce of the subject from the object by re-embedding the subject back into a life world, the world of Dasein, the world of always being thrown into a particular life world with a life task, always already doing something. And that embeds the subject back into the world and solves the Cartesian schism. That too, note, is an integral aspect. He's putting pieces back together. And so in this essay later on that he gives in the 1950s, he's taking the object, the transcendental object X of science, and embedding it back into the realm of meaning and value and significance that science had peeled away, and lifted it up by creating these sort of X-ray objects that are just denuded of all significance and meaning. And he's trying to embed these things back in their cultural contexts and in their life worlds, and give them, and showing how both art and ritual do that in creating worlds, the worlds in this way. And so Heidegger is trying to put all the pieces back together. And so that brings us where we wanted to come, I think, for this discussion.